Welcome to our Japanese style living environment webinar series. We will be in conversation with Dr. Frank L. Chance, who will introduce us to Japanese residential architecture. Thank you for joining us. And thanks to our partners who make this programming possible. The Japan Foundation Center for Global Partnership for funding, and to the Oakland Fukuoka Sister City Association for production. My name is Peter Boyer, your moderator. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Frank L. Chance. Frank L. Chance lived in Japanese-style structures nearly a decade. He brings this personal experience as well as experience with historic buildings such as Shofuso, the Japanese house and garden in Fairmount Park, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, USA, to his presentation. He currently serves as secretary of the Japan-America Society of Greater Philadelphia, the organization that oversees the preservation of Shofuso. Since retiring as the Associate Director of the Center for East Asian Studies in Philadelphia, Frank has undertaken the Shikoku 88 Temple Pilgrimage on foot, presented on the subject in Japan, North America, and Europe, and published an article on it in Education About Asia. He has also written about modern Japanese prints in the Journal of Japanese Studies. His next publication will be about the late Edo eclectic painter Tani Bunchō. He collaborates with the Foreign Policy Research Institute and the United States Japan Foundation's programs to train American teachers to include Japanese studies in the curriculum.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kim Andrews. I'm the Executive Director of the Japan-America Society of Greater Philadelphia, as well as Shofuso Japanese House and Garden, which is our well-known site. I want to introduce Frank Chance. I've known him for 10 years now. I've been doing this for 10 years, and I've known him for 10 years. Dr. Frank Chance is a retired Associate Director of the Center for East Asian Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. But I know him because he was previously the executive director of Shofuso at 1990, about 30 years ago. So he's been heavily involved with the Japanese house and the Skiya-style house and garden that we have in Philadelphia, certainly. But he's also lived over 10 years in Japan itself. He has undertaken the Shikoku 88 Temple Pilgrimage on foot. And he is really a foremost expert on Japanese residential architecture and Japanese gardens, which is my area that I love the most. So I'm so pleased that Peter reached out to Frank, and I'm more than pleased to introduce Dr. Frank Chance to you, as he's a mentor to me, and I hope that he's a great source of information and helpful vision to all of you. So thank you all. Welcome, Frank.
Okay, eventually you might see me on screen if we get the camera working. But for now, I want to start by talking about Japanese residential architecture. And what I'll be looking at is its history. That's going to take me a while. That's going to be the first part of our webinar today. Then we'll take a little break, and I'll come back and talk a little more about features of Japanese houses and what it's been like for me to live in Japanese houses and to work in Japanese style environments over time. So there are about 9 or 10 kinds of Japanese domestic architecture that I'm going to talk about. I'm not going to actually say anything about the predecessor to pit dwellings, which is cave dwellings. I think the notion of people living in caves is kind of the same around the world. But then we'll look at the evolution of the Japanese house, mostly looking at elite top-end houses until we get to the last 2 or 3 styles there, Minka, Machiya, and the modern hybrid style of Japanese house that incorporates some Western elements. So beginning about 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, Japan moved from the Paleolithic era into the beginnings of the Neolithic era, a hunter-gatherer economy that spread from the southern end of Japan all the way up to the northern end. We call these people the Jomon people because their pottery has cord markings, literally Jomon in Japanese, and that's the first way that they came to be known archaeologically. Their pottery ranges from very simple earthenware pots, where you can see the cord markings along the surface, to rather complicated pots that may have had ritual function, to ritual images, small clay images, sometimes as large as 1/2 meter or more in height, but most of them about 6 to 10 inches. That we don't know very much about their function, but we think they were for ritual purposes. The Jomon people lived in what we call pit dwellings. So there were holes in the ground about 2 feet deep or so, with a superstructure of wood and thatch above that. Very simple kind of dwelling. It's very similar to the kind of pit dwellings that people lived in after moving out of caves in China or Korea or the Middle East, lots of different parts of the world. Dwelling like that looks something like this if we reconstruct it today, made from thatch and a wooden frame around this hole in the ground. As time goes on, the Jomon culture is replaced by a more, I won't say more advanced culture, but a culture that's a little closer to what we think of as modern people. The remains of that culture were first found in a place called Yayoi in Tokyo, so it's called the Yayoi culture. But it began in Western Japan. The Yayoi people knew how to use a potter's wheel and make more advanced pottery. They also knew how to make bronze and even iron tools. But they still lived in pit dwellings. Now, sometimes these were a little larger and more complicated than the Jomon dwellings, but still the same basic kind of dwelling houses in the ground. At the same time, they began to live in villages, and the villages included raised towers as guard houses around the entrances, and also as storage houses, storehouses for the grain that they were starting to create, to make agriculturally. As time went on, these very small villages grew larger, and the pit dwellings, then we also have these sort of raised roof houses, and then buildings where the whole building is raised up out of the ground. At first used as storehouses, but then people decided that it was a little more pleasant to live above ground than in the ground. And so they moved on to that kind of structure as time went on. Moving forward another 500 years or so in history, the culture develops a phase where they're working together to make large tombs for some members of the society. It's the period when we start to have a greater and greater distinction between elite and ordinary people. The ordinary people working as conscripted labor to make these large tombs. To show you how big this tomb is, these little boxes along the side are houses. So the tomb itself is about 300 meters in length. This culture again spreads from South and Western Japan across most of the modern country. Those tombs were embellished with clay sculptures on the surfaces that include a lot of sculptures of people, including warriors, courtiers, and also including figures made of clay that imitate the houses that the people were living in. So we don't have many of their houses that survive archaeologically, but we do have these models that give us a sense of what they look like, and that can be reconstructed into a house something like this, with a floor raised up off the ground, dwelling area up the steps in the house, and then a thatched roof over the whole thing. And that further is going to develop into Japanese houses as we know them through most of their history. The best, most interesting example of that that survives from the period is actually something that's remade every 20 years at the Grand Shrine at Ise on the east coast of Japan. It's a shrine that began to be worshipped around the 5th century and was converted to its current form in 674. And what happens at Ise is that every 20 years, they take the old shrine and they build a new copy of it next door, and then take the old one down, and the new one stands for 20 years. Then they build one back in this space, so it moves back and forth. The last time it was rebuilt was 2013 and 2014. This is a photo from the 54, 55 rebuild. So you see the old one, new one rebuilt in 55. This one then becomes the old one, new one rebuilt in 1974. New one rebuilt in 1994, new one rebuilt in 2014. There'll be a new one rebuilt again in the 2030s, presumably. Every time they do this rebuild, they're actually making about 120 different buildings, all dedicated to Amaterasu Omikami, the female goddess of the sun. And the shrine at Ise is divided into the outer shrine, which is more modern kinds of buildings, and the inner shrine, which is this very early kind of building, again with a raised floor, a staircase leading up to it, the dwelling space in here, and a thatched roof over the whole top. Unfortunately, you can't go into this shrine unless you're a member of the imperial family of Japan. So I can't show you pictures of what the inside looks like, but I'm told that it's very, very plain, just wooden walls. Fast forward another 100 years. In the 8th century, we begin to establish permanently fixed capitals, like the one at Heijo, near the modern city of Nara. And the Heijo Palace was built around 710. Here's an overhead view of it. The modern city of Nara here. Todaiji Temple that you may be familiar with is over here just off your screen. So this is the palace site that's been excavated and a few buildings reconstructed. So it's a lot like the Ise building. The roof is a little smaller and thinner, a little more elegant structure, again, built up off the ground. That's important because, especially at this time of year in Japan, the weather can be very humid, very moist. It rains almost every day for a month or more at this time of year. And it's very nice to be up off the ground and a little bit away from that water. On the other hand, later in the summer, it'll get very hot. So it's nice to have water nearby, as they had here at the Heijo Palace, and as became standard feature of Japanese houses throughout history. If you're elite enough, if you're high enough ranked that you can own a house and a garden, your garden will naturally have water in it, which helps keep you cool in the hottest of the summer months. That palace and capital at Heijo turned out to have some problems. So about 100 years later, at the end of the 8th century, they decided to move. And they moved just from Heijo, which is roughly here, up about 50 miles north. So Heijo in the modern city of Nara. Here's the modern city of Osaka. Was not yet a city at that time. So here's Nara. And they decided to move the capital up here to what was then called Heian and what we now call Kyoto. There was a brief attempt in the 780s to build a capital at Nagaoka. That didn't work out. By the time they started constructing it, there were floods, landslides, and pestilence that started up there. So they abandoned that, and then 10 years later moved just a little farther to the north to the city of Heian, what we now call Kyoto. Heian was conveniently surrounded by mountains on the north and the east sides, open on the south and to some extent on the west, with a river running down the east side, another smaller river running down the west side of the city. Now, I can't show you a lot of the original city. It's been built over and destroyed by fires and so forth many times over the centuries. But I'll show you some reconstructions from 2001 film called Onmyoji. So that's where we get this aerial view of the ancient city of Heian. This is the plan of the city from the way it was laid out. The Imperial Palace at the north central part of the city, main avenue running down, two big Buddhist temples, Toji and Saiji, the Eastern Temple and the Western Temple, built here today. Today, the main train station of Kyoto is right about here. Of course, they didn't plan that into the 794 plan, which was based on the plan of the city of Chang'an in Tang, China, and which roughly maps onto this part of the modern city of Kyoto. Over the centuries, Kyoto grew to the east and north, not very much to the south and the west until much later. So it's a little hard to show you buildings from the Heian period. There aren't very many that survive. But if you look at the Imperial Palace in Kyoto, the so-called Gosho, this is a building remade in the 18th and 19th centuries, but still following much of the plan of the original Imperial Palace. So there's a coronation hall here with a big open courtyard. And then behind that, a series of residential halls with gardens to the east. In most Heian period estates, this garden would have been on the south rather than the east side. But for governmental purposes, they needed the south to be open for this big courtyard for annual ceremonies. So the coronation hall looks like this today. Rebuilt in the 1850s. Behind that, this is a reconstruction of what it was made to look like for the film, showing you the kind of ceremony that they undertook at the palace. Behind the coronation hall is the residential hall called the Seiryoden. The current emperor's great-grandfather was actually born in the palaces of Kyoto, great-great-great-grandfather. So up until the 1860s, this was the home of the Japanese sovereign. The building is interesting inside. The floors are polished wood rather than tatami mats, with a mat raised where the emperor would sit or where important people would sleep. There are also curtains around those mats, so that the emperor could have his privacy. And again, here as we see it recreated in the film. So you would never actually see the face of the emperor, only dimly through a gauze curtain. Well, other than the imperial family, the elite noble class of the Heian period lived in a style of house that we've come to know as shinden-zukuri. Literally means a hall for sleeping. The interesting thing about these is that it's not one hall for sleeping, it's many. So it was a polygamous society where one man would have several wives in this elite class. He would travel from one wife's sleeping quarters to another, to another, to another on different nights. And those sleeping quarters were all connected with raised corridors. And then on one side, usually the south side of the whole estate, there would be a garden built in as part of the structure. You might have a pavilion out at the end of a corridor to enjoy the garden from. Some of the other pavilions might be Buddhist chapels or even Shinto shrines, as well as sleeping quarters, and then smaller quarters for the servants and the other people who would have been helping out, helping this elite family to enjoy their life. Unfortunately, there are no buildings like this that survive. So again, we can get a little bit of a sense from the movie what it was like to play and enjoy the garden or hang out on the verandas and enjoy the space of the building as it flowed from the space inside the building to these large wooden verandas around the building. And then you could step down into the garden that surrounds it, particularly on the south side. Another way we can imagine how these buildings worked is to look at literature of the time, like Genji Monogatari, the tale of Genji, written by a court lady, Murasaki Shikibu. We don't know her real name, but we call her Murasaki, actually based on the name of one of the characters, who seems to be a lot like her. And she wrote this around the year 1000. We have illustrations of it that survive from around 100 years later that give a sense of the ladies of the court enjoying those shinden buildings and their court culture. They might be playing games, just having conversations, or enjoying other activities, all of which is being spied on by one of the men of the court from here in the corner. So there's a kind of peeping Tom quality to what's going on in the culture. Other things they did was, for example, here's one of the ladies holding a cage with a caged cricket that she's listening to the cricket singing. This is actually the court lady sitting on the floor. It would have been shocking for the women of the highest rank to be seen standing. One of the reasons for that is if you look at their clothing, the outfit could weigh as much as 70 or 80 pounds. So they didn't want to stand up if they didn't have to. But again, you get a sense of life between these rooms, the verandas, and the garden around them. A couple more examples. Here's the emperor and the hero of the story, the tale of, this is Genji, listening to a flute concert, again on that veranda looking out over the garden. And you have to imagine a roof over their heads, but if the roof was there, you couldn't see them. So they've taken the roof away for the purposes of the photo of the painting. One more concert on a veranda. And people actually living and sleeping in those rooms, again, viewed as though the roof had been blown away. So you get a little bit of a sense of what the Shinden-zukuri style was like. Not much privacy, although there's always the pretense that you can't hear or see anything going on the other side of the cloth screens. Well, around the 12th century, that Heian aristocratic culture begins to break down. Power shifts from the capital and the imperial family to estates in the provinces that are watched over by sheriffs and bailiffs and other warrior types who gradually start to accumulate power for themselves. As they do, their own style of architecture begins to develop. That's a kind of transitional style that's sometimes called Shuden-zukuri or Buke-zukuri, the warrior style. One of the best examples of this is probably the Kyakuden of Kojo-in at Miidera in Shiga Prefecture. You'll see why I have a particular interest in this building in a couple of minutes, but it's also often hailed as one of the best surviving examples of this transitional Shuden style. So the building is a single unit. It doesn't have a kitchen or a bath attached to it because today it has another building next to it that has kitchen and bathrooms and those kinds of things. When we say guest quarters, we don't really mean it's like a hotel or a house. It was in fact where a high-ranking guest, and we know that members of the imperial family sometimes stayed at this particular guest quarters. And the guest would have stayed in the main room, servants in the rooms surrounding them, food brought in from other buildings around the outside. The whole thing with a large veranda on the east side in this case. Again, entry on the, so this is entry on the south. This is actually the west side, I'm sorry. So here's the entry side of the building that you see from the outside. It's not a very impressive entry. It is, after all, behind a gate and has its own courtyard. Just a set of steps up to a set of doors. Most people come in and out of the building actually from the other buildings on the side today. Inside, there are plain rooms with tatami mats covering the whole floor. That gradually develops during this Shuden-zukuri style. A big tokonoma, space set aside for displaying flower arrangements or sculptures, paintings, but also painted in and of itself. Beside that, a shigaidana with different level shelves, little cupboards, and then in this case, up a step is a shoin space which can be used as a study that looks out onto the garden on the one side and onto the veranda on the other side. The garden here is quite small because the building is set up against the side of a mountain, but the veranda steps right down into the pond of the garden. So this is that same view from the other side. So that's a sort of transitional style. I'm going to leap forward another 100 years or so into the fully developed Shoin style. And one of our best examples of that is the Shoin palace structure of Nijo Castle, built by the shogun, the warlord, as his show of power in Kyoto, where the Shujo, what we today would call Tenno or emperor, held his court still in Kyoto. So the castle doesn't survive in a very strict sense. The castle grounds and the main fortified part of the castle were here. That all burned down in the 1780s and was never really replaced. But we do have the original 17th century palace built for the shogun to stay in when he was in Kyoto, with public spaces where he could meet other warlords, and then more private spaces for the shogun, and still more private space for his wife or wives and family. So again, the public spaces built to show to other warlords and to the emperor to prove his power, all of that overlooking an expansive and extravagant garden. And then the private quarters back in the corner, and then all the way back the private quarters for the shogun's wife. So these are the exteriors of the main buildings, overlooking this beautiful 17th century garden. And here you can get a sense of how the building and the garden are intimately related. Same space viewed from the other direction. And I want to show you a couple of the interiors. These are this is the public open space designed to show off the power of the shogun, the warlord, to both other subsidiary warlords and to the imperial messengers that came to visit him as well. And then if you go farther back into the building, it's a little more intimate. This is still a public space in the sense that it's for the shogun to talk to his familial members, his family of retainers. And then behind that is the even more intimate space of the wife's chambers. Another example of that kind of space, I'm not going to show you the interior, but the exterior only here is at Katsura-rikyu, where the show-in style survives for the main residential buildings, but the Sukiya style, which you'll recognize from the magazine's name, applies particularly to the 4 tea houses that are scattered around the garden at Katsura. Built in the early 17th century by 2 princes of the imperial family on land given them by the shogun. So it's kind of an example of the interplay of power and exchange of property between the shogun and the imperial family. The advisor for the development here was tea master Kobori Enshu, and his style, his taste, it very definitely shows up in the Sukiya style of these tea houses throughout the grounds. So the central palace, again with a show-in desk structure and space with painted walls, and then a translucent white paper on the outer walls, and larger space in the more public areas, and then smaller and smaller spaces as you go back on a diagonal. The outbuildings include tea houses for each season, as well as other things like waiting areas. So here's the main house, tea house, tea waiting area, a little mausoleum, another tea house, scattered throughout this rather large garden. So just a little waiting area, the shokate. But even the waiting area is very elegant and beautifully designed. Just a little place to sit and wait for your tea ceremony to be ready to begin in one of the main halls. One for each season. The Shokin-te is a winter pavilion. So it's a little bit heavier thatched roof with spaces inside, some decorated walls, some very plain walls, and all leading to this intimate little tea space where the tea master could come in and prepare and serve the tea on the hearth here with the guests sitting beside it. Gepparo is an autumn building associated with the full moon. And again, with views out into the garden, very elegant space inside. Shoiken, Forgetting Yourself, is a summer building. Lighter, again, with both painted walls and those translucent screens at the outside edges. So that gives you a sense of Katsurarikyu. That sort of ends our survey of the most elite style of housing. Maybe I should take a break for a minute and see if there are any questions thus far. And then we'll talk about more plebeian houses in just a minute. So are there any questions?
Let's see. Yeah, this is Peter here. There aren't any questions in the Q&A. I would encourage anyone to type their questions pronto. Leading by example, I have a question for you, Frank. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, I have another question for you. These seasonal tea houses, are they looking upon different sectors of the garden that maybe, for instance, the autumn one might have a lot of fall color, the spring one a lot of flowers? And are they also having different seasonal equipment, such as, you know, a foot warming pit, or you get the picture?
I'm going to give you a kind of a mixed answer. It's all one garden. And of course, each of the tea houses is in a different section of the garden, but you're always looking across the pond at the other sections of the garden. So, for example, you might have one building that's right next to the beach here, the Pebble Beach. That's associated with a chapter of the Tale of Genji that's set into the autumn. So it's a poetic reference as well as a part of the garden in a literal sense. Other parts of the garden have trees. I didn't happen to bring any photos of it from the autumn, but it does have very beautiful maple trees. And as you can see, trees that lose all their leaves in the winter and so forth. So it does change according to the seasons. And each of the tea houses is decorated in a seasonal way, so you get a much lighter sense in the summer tea house than you would in the winter tea house, for example.
We do have some other questions here in the question and answer window.
Okay.
So let's see. There's only three, so I'm going to read them out loud one at a time. Wendy Miko asks, considering the reverence for nature, speak about the grid system apparent in architecture and layouts. So that's a request. Even villages and towns are on a grid, not relating to the contour of an adjacent river, ...
Okay. Well, if we come back to the plan of Katsura, for example, to the overview, you can see that it's not a grid at all. It's very much I won't say a natural environment because it's all built and planted and created, but it's made to imitate a natural setting. The creation of the grid city is a phenomenon of primarily the 7th and 8th century in Japan, in imitation of Chinese cities. So at that time, the way of showing authority and power was to import it from China. So they imported the city plan, that squared off grid, from the Chinese city. And as time goes on, they moved farther and farther away from that. So that if you look at cities that developed in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, like Edo or Osaka, they're developed on a much more organic kind of plan that's a lot freed up from the grid system. On the one hand, it's a more natural system. On the other hand, it's a whole lot easier to find an address in Kyoto than it is to find one in Tokyo, because of the way the cities developed on that natural or as opposed to the grid plan. So remember that we've been
Charles Thompson.
Go ahead.
When you're done, there's a few other questions.
Okay, remember that we've been looking at the houses of the elite and powerful. So this is an imperial prince's house with an extensive garden around it. We'll see when we look at ordinary people's houses that it's quite different. Not that people don't want a garden, but they just can't afford to have 40 acres of garden the way the imperial prince could afford it at Katsura.
Speaking of extraordinary property layouts, Charles Thompson asks, why are the early temples, I think he's referring to the shrines, rebuilt every 20 years?
Well, the glib answer, and the one you'll get if you ask at the shrine itself, is that women like new houses. And Amaterasu is a female goddess, and she has let it be known through her communications with we mere mortals that she wants a new house every 20 years. So we oblige her by building a new house for her every 20 years. So it's become a part of the ritual of that shrine lineage that it's rebuilt every 20 years. Issei is the only lineage of shrines that actually does that. If you think about the Izumo shrines, for example, dedicated to her brother, the storm god, they're rebuilt only when they've been destroyed or some natural disaster causes them to be lost. So it's a very different sort of situation. But apparently Amaterasu told her priests that she wanted a new house every 20, and so they rebuild her one every 20 years. It's a very convenient schedule because if you think about the young man that works on the rebuilding, say in 2014, 2013, His father might be the carpenter who's overseeing the rebuild, and his father, the grandfather, is keeping a distant eye on the father and the son. So every 20 years. 20 years from now, that father who's now overseeing the project is going to become the grandfather who's overseeing the whole project. The son who's now working as a laborer will have grown up another 20 years and become the overseer for the individual part of the project. So it's a natural continuity that's built into that 20-year cycle.
Wendy Migo also asks, was the interior of the roof peak used for storage or open for air circulation? These are the same shape as California barn roofs. That's California, USA.
Okay, if you look at these open roofs, you'll see that there's, at these roofs, there you'll see that there's an opening at either end of the roof. And in the elite houses, that's just basically an open space. It allows air to flow through the building. It helps keep it cool in summer. As we'll see in more ordinary people's houses, it's a very different situation. So we'll talk about that in more detail in a minute. These were also in the warrior buildings. Those roof spaces and the space below the floor are also famous as places where spies, quote, ninja, end quote, spies or other nefarious people could be hiding. So it's not that they have no use, but they're mainly a space for air circulation.
Sharon Brie asks what species of wood was used for these structures.
Okay, the elite of the elite, the best of the best structures are all made from hinoki, Chamaecyparis obtusa, if you like Latin. It's a tree that's often called the Japanese false cypress. I can talk about it more a little bit later when I have some pictures of the actual wood.
Yeah, that'd be appropriate.
So we'll talk about that more later on, but hinoki is the best of the best for these buildings. So a building like the Kojo in Kyakuden or the buildings at Katsura are all made of hinoki. There may be a little bit of other wood used in the building in various parts, but the primary structural material is hinoki.
Sharon also asks, she says, you mentioned seasonal decorations in the rooms. What sort of decorations were used and what materials did they consist of?
Well, the rooms have paintings either on the walls themselves, if I can get my, here's my cursor, either on the wall, which you can see painted here, which is a plaster, wattle and daub plaster wall, but then with a thin layer of clay that's been painted with cobalt blue and gold leaf in this very light kind of pattern in the summer building. The sliding paper screens could also be painted. We'll come back to that again later on in the second part of the presentation and talk a little bit more about paintings and other decorations at that point. Decorations could also be brought into the rooms. So for example, if there's a tea ceremony in here, you might lay felt over the tatami mats. You would bring in equipment for the tea ceremony. And the buildings also have, if I can find one where it's visible, you might have a hearth in the floor. or actually, here's a little corner of one, kitchen or other kinds of spaces for preparing food, boiling hot water, and that sort of thing. So it's a combination of different things.
Would this be a good time to back up to the slide showing the tokonoma and the Chigadana shelves?
Yeah. Well, there's one here. Back up one more. So this is a tokonoma. The Chigaidana is the shelves beside it. The shoin is this feature built into the wall with a little bit of a desk space that you could sit on the floor and use this as a desk beside it. So the three main features of a shoin building are the Chigaidana, these shelves, a little closer view here, this set of shelves, the tokonoma, this alcove where you can hang paintings or place sculpture, and then the shoin itself. In warrior buildings, we also often have this feature called a chodai gamai, long name. It's actually a security feature. These are pop-out doors behind which your security guards would be stationed during your meeting, so that if anybody in the meeting causes any trouble, these guys can pop right out with their swords and take care of any conflict in the meeting.
I love it, bouncers.
Yep.
I should mention to the audience that last weekend we heard from a presenter who's a master of bonsai and another who did tray landscapes. Those are two items that would be placed on the raised floor of the tokonoma alcove
Yes.
for display.
And of course, in the tea rooms, here, even in the waiting area, you have a little chigaidana. That's a place where you can put bronze incense burner or small flower arrangements. In the bigger tokonoma in the tea room, you would often have a flower arrangement as well, and a scroll with seasonal words or pictures, either one. Okay, any other questions?
Oh, look at this. All I have to do is scroll down. So Hiromi asks, she says, every time I go to an old Japanese castle, I always wonder how many bathrooms they used to have. The place is so big, and just wondering how long people had to walk to do the business. That's a great question. Thank you, Hiromi.
A good question. I know at the tour at Katsura, they never show you where the bathrooms are. I can tell you where, if I went back to the plan at Nijo Castle. Here's this is a public space. There's a bathroom off of here, and there's a bathroom off of the private quarters. But I think if you're here for a public ceremony, as one of the retainers or one of the rival warlords, I think you just may have to hold it for a long time. But the private living quarters, there is a bathroom associated, a toilet associated with that. There's also one associated with the men's quarters here. Katsura, I don't really know, but each of the tea houses has its own little bathroom off to the side of it, and I suspect that there's a bathroom somewhere in this complex at least one. I can say more about that when we look at this is a good time to transition into the more plebeian dwellings. We can talk about that a little more. Okay.
Well, before you transition there, Timothy Gardner asks, how is storage of everyday and seasonal items handled?
Well, in these elite compounds, there is always a kura, a warehouse, a storage building. That's a separate building. It's a fireproof building. You wouldn't want to live in one. It would be very unpleasant. No breeze in the summer. Thick walls made of limed plaster so that they're fireproof. But everything is stored in there. So just the few things that would be needed for day-to-day use would be stored in the actual show-in rooms. And again, I could talk more about that for the plebeian dwellings where there's storage within the building. But for these elite structures, there's usually a separate storage area. I can show you, I have a couple of those later on in the private, in the smaller buildings too. Okay.
Let's see. Last question. Wendy Miko asks, what about the mosquitoes in summer?
Indeed. Fortunately, they learned as early as the Heian period that if you burned incense made from chrysanthemum leaves, that the mosquitoes didn't like it. And so they stayed away. But it's a problem. But chrysanthemum incense was used, and you can still buy it in Japan. But it's been around at least since the 10th century.
Still used as an insecticide today.
Yes. I bring it back from Japan and burn it when I have a backyard party here in Philadelphia.
Okay, I'm sure there'll be more features in the plebeian houses. Frank, that's it for the Q&A, and we can, everybody, we will be taking a break at some point in the presentation whenever Frank feels that's convenient.
Let me talk about plebeian houses and then we'll take a little break.
Okay.
Okay, so many different kinds of plebeian houses. I'm only going to talk about a couple of types. One is the countryside farmhouse, what we generally in Japanese would call a minka. Perhaps the most beautifully preserved examples are at places like Shirakawa-go, which is a World Heritage Site in Gifu Prefecture, Takayama, which is not too far from Shirakawa. And then there are some other examples of these buildings throughout Japan. The ones, especially the ones in Shirakawa-go, but all the ones in northern Japan are what are called gassho zukuri. Gassho is the gesture of putting your hands together. We think of it in English as a prayer gesture, but in Japanese culture, it's a gesture that, for example, Buddhist monks, when they meet each other, when they greet each other, they will make this gesture. Anjali Mudra, if you're a yoga practitioner, putting the hands together. So the roofs of these houses are thought to look like the hands put together in that quote unquote praying hands gesture. It's also a gesture of thanks in Japanese culture. So the roofs are very steep in Shirakawa-go, for example, because there's a lot of snow. They might have a meter or more of snow during the winter. And by having the roof very steep, the snow just falls off the sides and piles up around the edges of the house. The ends of the house are just straight with a wooden wall, again with doors that open and close at various levels. The family lives primarily on the first floor. There might be some sleeping chambers or sleeping areas on the second floor. The top floor, originally at least in these houses, was used for silkworms. So the top floor was a place where they would keep silkworms, bringing them the mulberry leaves in for the silkworms to eat in the summer. And then as the silkworms matured and they made cocoons, they would turn those cocoons into silk. So it's very much a part of the agricultural economy of this area. In other areas where they didn't do silkworm culture, sometimes these third floors or upper floors are used for drying the leaves of tobacco plants or other things that needed to be dried as part of the agricultural process. The main floor, you divide it up into spaces with polished wood floors. There are usually spaces that's way in the back here, you can't really see it, with earthen floors. In some areas, the earthen floor area was actually used for farm animals, horses or oxen that actually slept in the house with the family during the coldest part of the winter. Of course, they had barns or sheds for these animals as well. The family then would live around the hearth, and there might be several hearths in one of these big houses. You also would end up having 2, 3, sometimes even 4 generations of family members, and sometimes farm workers or agricultural helpers living in the same house. The hearth is actually important also because the smoke from the fire would soak into the roof. Let me go back to the roof for a minute. These roofs are not hinoki by any stretch of the imagination. These are thatch made from kind of plants that grow by the river's edge and just look like reeds, bound together, bundled into thatched roofs. Now that thatch ages over time. This is a new one in the back here. The older ones start to look a little shaggy after a while. And it was important in the old days that the smoke from that fire would go up and soak through the thatch and keep the insect life down in the upper part of the roof. Of course, when you're growing the silkworms, you don't want that smoke to be up there killing off your silkworms. So you'd make sure there was a better ventilation. But that would be during the summer and you might not have so much fire going in any case. But in the winter, that irori is an important part of the whole situation. So the minka, again, there are different patterns in different parts of the country, but this is an important style of dwelling. At the opposite end, in the city, the ordinary people, as opposed to the elite, lived in small houses that you can imagine would be lined up, one house next to the next to the next, in rows along the city. There might be an entry area, a couple of tatami mat rooms, maybe a little pathway along the side out to the toilet. Maybe if you're rich enough, you might have a bath back in the back corner, or you would go to a public bath. But then also every one of these houses, they try to have a little space for an indoor or a garden that would be open to the sky. So there's always a little bit of nature attached to the house in any case. This is one from Tokyo that survived into the 20th century. There are also rows of these houses in places like, this is Gion in Kyoto. Most of these have been converted into more modern buildings, but they keep the facade so that it retains its historical feeling of the neighborhood. Or this street in Kanazawa. So you can see that the first floor in most of these is a shop, maybe a restaurant, maybe a sake dealership, sake shop, maybe a doll manufacturer, some kind of a shop on the first floor. And then the family would live on the second floor above their own shop. Fairly tight, fairly dense urban quarters. But in the back, some kind of a little garden space, what we call a tsubo niwa, a courtyard garden, with a few plants, either growing literally in tsubo, vases or pots, or growing in the ground and open to the sky, but definitely in soil that had to be brought in to refresh the space. So the exterior might look very plain, but inside that it can be quite fancy. Let me show you a couple of nice examples of townhouses. This is one that's preserved in the eastern part of Kyoto, called the Rakuto Ihokan today. Rakuto, Eastern Kyoto, Eastern Kyoto. Ihokan is just a fancy word for museum, really. Built around 1650s, but added to, changed later on, so that it's a little bit different today. This is what, if you go through that first gate, what you see. The actual entrance to the house is here on the side. But you've already got this sense of a little separate garden, separated from the world, even though this is where the house, the family was doing its business and business dealings with the outside world. If we look at it from above, the street we were on is here. Here's the entrance in that first little space. Then you go through the house. There's a big courtyard garden, but there are also little courtyard gardens stuck in the corners. And then the next family's house begins somewhere up here or right here. Again, various parts of the house will look out onto these little tsuboniwa gardens. You get a sense of nature always close at hand, if not right next to you. I don't have a photo of it, but this house definitely has rooms with tokonoma, alcoves, and chigaidana in it as well, although they're much smaller than the rooms we would have seen in the Shoin style houses. So one more, I'm going to go to Okayama, down here near Hiroshima on the inland sea coast in Western Japan. Again, from the street, it looks like nothing. It just looks like another building. This is the Ohashi house. The Ohashis were sake brewers and sake dealers. So they were a relatively wealthy town family. The shop, this is the street, the shop, storage for sake and other things that they were selling and using. You also have a kura warehouse to the side where they could store their valuables. But then there was also some storage space within the rooms of the house itself. So this is looking back out into the street. Here's the entrance to the main house. So you've gone through the business zone into the main part of the house. To your right is a kura warehouse that today serves as a museum. This is once you step into that first entrance, you see the more public parts of the building where they might have met guests or done some of their business. Storage in chests and closets built in, but also doors onto little tea rooms or other parts of the house where they could entertain themselves. So some rooms used for business, the hibachi. We're going to come back to how they kept these places warm in the winter. But again, this sense of looking from one room to the next room to the next room to the next room, diagonally through the building. Rooms were often decorated with paintings. I'm sorry, the photo's not a very good one, so it's a little hard to tell what the subject of the painting is, and it's not in very good condition. But it does give you a little more sense of what these places looked like when they were lived in. But other rooms, this would have been a sleeping room in the back for probably not the main members of the family, but secondary, younger or younger members of the family, younger brothers who were not inheriting the main line of the household, etc. Here's the warehouse. So space that's between the stone slates and the lime plaster is made quite fireproof, with a door that definitely closes and keeps anything inside safe and away from thieves, rats, and fire. You look the other way, you get a view through the entry garden, into another garden, into another garden. Each of these little gardens you can see from the rooms inside the building. But you can also be quite close to them. One thing we do note is that there are lots of hand washing basins, and that usually tells you there's a bathroom right around the corner from there. So lots of these little spaces. They also have a tea room for tea ceremony built into the main part of the house. You can tell that the Ohashis did quite well at their sake distribution business. So they were able to have a big house and a lot of garden space. And now we're going to go back out and leave them. So I'm going to fast forward another 100 years. There are some transitional stages in here that I'm not going to talk about, but to leap to the conclusion of the modern hybrid home. It has aspects of Western style. For example, solid walls, windows. You'll notice that the windows all have shutters that either come down from the top or slide off to the side. So it can be completely closed off at night or in rainstorms. The door is now a Western style swinging door that locks, and little tiny space for a car beside it. Not exactly a garage, but just a parking slot so you can park your car off the street. You might have sliding glass doors in the back part of the house leading onto the tsuboniwa, the little garden that's behind the house. This is not that same building, but a similar kind of structure. You might have one or two Japanese style rooms with tatami mats. You probably also have a Western style kitchen with a wooden floor. Very small kitchens. We can talk more about kitchens later. And one or more Western style rooms with chairs and desks and so forth. So that basically finishes the historical survey of Japanese houses. Do we want to take any more questions and or
we have questions.
take a short break? And then we'll
Sounds
go on
good.
to the features of the modern Japanese. But I can take questions first.
Okay, let's see. You answered what the bundles of reeds along the Minka were. Let's see. Hi, folks, get typing. Meantime, Patty Fletcher, welcome again, Patty, is asking if this meeting and others of the series are being recorded and can people access them in the future? So yes, they're being recorded, absolutely. And with the intention of publish, likely, I understand they'll be posted on YouTube. So patient, and they'll be available again for further viewing. We just have to work out the technical and budgetary details, and we'll get to that. And everyone who attends one of these webinars had to register, and the reason for that was so that we'd have your email, and there must be a way to gather up all those emails and announce the YouTube publication. Timothy Gardner asks, one modern kitchen showed a trap door in the floor. Is this where the pickling jugs would be stored?
Well, not so much in a modern house. The houses I know that have this door in the floor, that's actually a refrigerator. It's a refrigerated space in some houses. So in addition to the regular refrigerator, you also might have a refrigerated space in the floor. Now, if you go back to the older houses, the Minka or the Machiya, they often had space underneath the floor, indeed, for pickling storage and for other kinds of food storage. Your carrots will keep a lot longer in a cool space under the floor than they would just out on a shelf.
A root cellar. Richard Peak asks, we've heard that, oh, by the way, Richard asked this at the close of our last one, so we're gonna have to back you up here, Frank. Richard asks, we've heard that the Shirakawa-go has had issues finding the reeds necessary for their thatch roofs. They had to search all over Japan for one roof. Any concerns or comments about the thatched roofs here?
Yes, it's a problem. We in the modern world don't like open marshland very much. And that's where the reeds were actually cultivated along the open marshes beside a lot of rivers. But as we pave over more and more land and put roads beside the rivers and that sort of thing, the places where the reeds are grown are becoming fewer and fewer. And while there has been some effort to replant and to kind of replace those wetlands in the last decade or so, it's a long, slow process, and it's hard to find that kind of land. By the way, the same problem exists for bark roofs, like the hinoki bark roof of Ise or of the imperial buildings at Katsura. Used to be a very lively industry of people who harvested the bark of the hinoki trees. The average age of the person involved in that industry today is something like 72 years old. And when you realize that harvesting it means climbing up the tree and slicing down the bark off the outside of the tree, climbing up sometimes 20 meters above the ground to do that. 72-year-old men are not very pleased about doing that. And we need to find more young people who are willing to do that. Also, there are not a lot of trees available for that kind of harvesting either. So yes, it's a problem.
Let's see. Another attendee asks for information about future webinars. Frank, this pertains to the series as a whole. You can get the complete schedule of all the webinars, not just, many organizations are publicizing some of these webinars, but to get the complete schedule periodically, you may just send an email to the following address. Oh, I'll type it in the chat box too. jpnliven@gmail.com. And you'll get an automated response with the complete description of the webinar, including a link to register for it. Then Hiromi again asks, in Gosho houses, why do they keep silkworms in the upper part of the house, up in the attic? Was it because it was warm, or just because it was space saving?
Back up to that space. They actually used in many of these houses the second floor. If I can back up, it's a lot of backing up, but I'll get there. So the second floor was an area where they did a lot of work on the silk. So they would do spinning and weaving on the second floor. The third floor wasn't a very convenient place to live for people, but it was apparently warm enough that the silkworms liked it in the summer, but they could also open up the ends and let breeze flow through. And I think it was just a good space to do that. You also wanted to keep the worms protected from predators like birds and so forth. So you want to keep them safe, but at the same time have a place for them to live. So these planks, in addition to being a way you could walk from one end of the space to the other, could also be covered with fresh mulberry leaves that would feed the silkworms.
Frank, when you first showed this slide, you mentioned hanging tobacco leaves and any other agricultural products. And I want to second that. I've seen the tobacco barns in the Carolinas, and I even had some outlaw friends who were hanging illegal plants from the rafters. And
yes,
we also used to hang dried flowers from the rafters of roofs. It's a wonderful way to be able to walk sort of down the middle and have essentially rows of hanging inventory of whatever. And of course, the steep pitch roofs necessitated by heavy snowfall, it's just a space and there's a use.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, I lived through the 60s too, and I know about drying plant leaves a little bit.
Okay, let's see. I think there's one more question. Oh yeah, okay. Frank, that does it for
Okay.
Q&A at this moment.
All right, I want to talk a little bit about the design of Japanese houses and how it works. So we've talked about the history of Japanese domestic architecture. cover features of Japanese houses and a little bit about the experience of Japanese houses and maybe some notes on environmental concerns and issues. I wanted to start out by talking about my life in Japanese houses. I think I've lived in 5 of them in different places. I don't have pictures of all of them. This is the first one I lived in. It's a hybrid house, very definitely, called Jayhawk House. It was in Momoyamadai, in the suburbs of Osaka. I lived there, not actually for the full 5 years, 76 to 81, but beginning in 76 for a couple of years. Then I lived in another hybrid row house that I don't have any pictures of because that space is completely gone. Anyway, this first house I lived in also had a classroom. So I taught English in the house to help pay for it. And also taught at a women's junior college at the same time. Then I came back to the States for a while, and from 83 to 85, I lived in Kyoto in what essentially was a machiya, but a modern version of one. A little bit hybrid. Certainly has a big entrance here. This is like a garage space. And then a couple of living spaces on the first floor, bedrooms on the second floor. And there was a bath, toilet, and tsuboniwa, and then a little tiny back bedroom at the other end of the house. That's still there. This is actually a photo from Google Earth. The building is still very much there. Then I came back to the States, and in the 1990s, I was the director of Shofuso, the Japanese house and garden in Fairmount Park, Philadelphia. So a lot of what I have to say is based on this building, very near and dear to my heart, and also a very interesting example of what Japanese houses are like and can be, maybe the best of Japanese houses in some ways. Shofuso, this building was created to be displayed in New York as an exhibition house at the Museum of Modern Art in downtown Manhattan. It was designed by Yoshimura Junzo, with a garden designed by Sano Tansai. And it was displayed there from June 20th of 1954 to October of 1955. And just about 250,000 people saw it while it was there. This is a picture of the show-in, the main room of the house during that exhibition. Relaxed time. This is Yoshimura Junzo, the architect. This is Arthur Drexler, the curator of the exhibition as a whole. This is the show-in and the shigaidana of the building. I'll show you what it was like a little bit. If it looks a little bit like the plan of the Kojo Inn, it's very deliberate. Yoshimura studied a lot of Japanese houses before he made this one, but decided that this was the best choice was to model it on the Kojo Inn Kyakuden. So it's very much the same kind of space. He made the main room a little bigger and the subsidiary rooms smaller, adjusted the proportions in some ways, but it's based on that building. Here you can see it just as it was being completed at MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art, how it very much fits into the canyon of New York buildings. Like the Kojo Inn, it has views out onto garden spaces. The little garden is very, very close up to it, just as at Kojo Inn. The garden was close to the house because of the mountain. Here, the garden is close to the house because After all, the courtyard of the Museum of Modern Art in New York is not a very big space for a house and a garden. So it's very parallel to that kind of space. Here we're seeing it from the other direction. So you've got the big veranda. Show that one more time. Big veranda looking out over the garden to show in the main rooms and then the rest of the house behind it. This is during construction when the pond didn't have any water, for example. So after it was displayed at MoMA, 1954 and 5, not surprisingly, the Museum of Modern Art wanted its courtyard back. And so there was a big debate over what to do with the house. There were offers to take it to New York, to Washington, and put it in the Japanese consulate. But the original donors, including David Rockefeller and others, didn't want that to happen because they wanted it to be accessible to American citizens, not to Japanese visiting their own consulate. There were a lot of discussions, and ultimately it ended up moving to Philadelphia. Why? Well, the site in Philadelphia was also the site of the Japanese house display space at the 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. The current Japanese house is just behind where the 1876 Japanese house was. We've done recently some excavations of the site and found out exactly where it was, and found out a little bit about this first Japanese garden ever built in the United States. This lantern, for example, is still in Fairmount Park, still near the site of the original building. That building was taken down after the exposition ended, but the site was retained, and in 1906, this temple gateway from Japan, which had been at the St. Louis World's Fair, was brought to Philadelphia and installed there. Everyone in Philadelphia knew it as the pagoda, even though it's not a pagoda, it's actually a temple gateway from the 15th century. But unfortunately, that burned down in 1955, and it was big news. It made the newspapers. There were photographs of the rather dramatic fire. But the space in front of it was a pond and had been landscaped into something resembling a Japanese garden. So in 1955, just as the house, the Shofuso, was closing in New York, this space became available because this temple gateway burned down. It took them 3 years to move it and to install it. This is a photo from 1961. It's as close as I can get to 58, of the house as it was installed and opened in October of 1958. And it has stood there ever since. Actually, in 58, Sano Tansai, the designer of the garden in New York, was brought here and designed the garden to go with the house. Yoshimura came and watched over some of the installation as well. At that time, it still had beautiful paintings by Higashiyama Kai on the sliding door screens and the tokonoma. Shofu, Pine Breeze, gives the name of the house, Shōfūsō, Pine Breeze Pillow. Unfortunately, by the end of the 1960s, it wasn't being very well cared for. There wasn't a lot of crowd control. And so it fell into disrepair. But for the Bicentennial Expo in 1976, The Japan Foundation came up with a lot of money and put together a nearly $1 million project to replace the roof, renew the house, and put it back into displayable condition. At that time, volunteers came and learned to show people the Japanese tea ceremony. And that group formed the core of the Friends of the Japanese House and Garden, who have been taking care of the house ever since the late 1970s. So these are bundles of Hiwada roof bark. They did replace the roof completely in 1976. That roof had to be replaced again in 1999 and 2000, just as my tenure at the Japanese House as director was ending. So this is the show-in, that built-in desk, the Chugaidana shelves, and the tokonoma as they were in the 1990s when I was there. But it was a very plain building. Unfortunately, Higashiyama Kai's paintings had been destroyed or lost in the intervening years, and the restoration group didn't have enough money to get new paintings. So they just replaced the sliding doors with plain white paper and a little bit of patterned paper in the tokonoma. And then the painter Senju Hiroshi, Mr. Senju saw the reopening of the house after the 1999 to 2000 renewal, and lamented the fact that his teachers' paintings were no longer visible. So he offered to give us new paintings in his own style, very much contemporary style, representing waterfalls coming down both the tokonoma and the Fusuma sliding paper doors. And we've been presenting those to the public since 2008. The garden was designed by Sano Tansai. Some elements that are very much like the garden at Kojo Inn and in New York. Other elements that are much different. There's a lot bigger space, a lot more room to work with. This cherry tree, weeping cherry tree, that was on the site of the temple gateway is still there and still healthy and still making beautiful flowers every spring. The pine on the island, the maples in the distance are all parts of the original Sano plan. But in fact, it's not one garden, it's three. There's a show-in garden for the main house, a Roji tea garden for the tea house, and then a Tsuboniwa courtyard garden like you might find in a machiya between the tea house and the main house. Similarly, it's three houses, a show-in main house, a tea house, and a kitchen. I'm not going to talk much about the tea house today, but we'll come back to the kitchen in a little bit. Now, Shofuso is a interesting building because it's got its own unique features, as well as features that you find in almost every Japanese house. For example, the main entrance to the building is a shikidai, a wooden platform designed so that if you're talking about the Kojo Inn, the imperial visitor there might greet a messenger from the imperial court who would sit on the shikidai and talk up the stairs to the imperial visitor. So this is a feature that Yoshimura retained from the original Kojo Inn plan. Next to that is what I would call a genkan, a space where people can take off their shoes and leave them outside, because it being a Japanese house, we're not going to wear our shoes into the actual building. More typical genkan looks like this, with doors that close and a space inside where you can take your shoes off and leave them and then go into the rest of the house. As a traditional Japanese house, Shofuso's floors are covered with tatami. This is a close-up view of one and in the process of being installed. So you can see that it's rice straw, about 2 inches thick, and a thin layer of reed matting on top of that. And then finished off with brocade edges and laid down on the floor, covering almost the entire floor of the interior of the house. The tokonoma, as it existed in 1991, when I began as the director, and then as it was transformed by Senju's murals, we still can use it to hang a scroll or painting. We no longer use it for flower arrangements because, sorry about that. We no longer use it for flower arrangements because spraying the flowers to keep them fresh would, of course, not be very good for the paintings. The engawa, the veranda that you saw in both the Kojo Inn and the house as it was in New York, is still there. It looks out to the east and a little bit south. It's a very important space. It provides a place for people to go and look at the garden. It's also a space that in the winter, sunlight comes in underneath the deep eaves and warms up the space and makes it quite pleasant. But in the summer, it's in the shade, it catches the wind. And cools the house. The roof is hiwada, the bark of the hinoki tree. The structure of the house is all hinoki wood. There's a little bit of other wood used in a few parts of the house, but the structure is entirely hinoki. Just to purchase the wood to make this house, if you were to try to remake it today, would be millions of dollars. It's very expensive, very beautiful wood. Another strange feature are the shutters. Japanese houses almost always have shutters. These are odd because they fit between the columns. So they're ma-iri-do, as opposed to most Japanese houses which have amado that slide outside the columns and into a pocket at the end of the row. This gives you a little better sense in another building how that amado works on a track at the edge of the veranda, whereas at Shofuso, the track is right next to the shoji and the rooms on the inside of the veranda. But like most traditional Japanese houses, it's a case of floor culture. So people would sit on cushions on the floor or directly on the floor. If you wanted to relax, you might have an armrest. In the winter, you would be next to a hibachi with charcoal fire in it to keep you warm. That was the only heating system for traditional houses like this. You would take your meals on the floor, at least the chief guest, the important person who was staying there, would be served on a tray like this. But also their servants, their helpers might also eat off of trays like this as well. One thing we don't have at Shofuso that's an important part of modern Japanese floor culture is a device called a kotatsu. invented during the Edo period in the 16th century. These were originally a small low table that you can sit at. Back in the Edo period, they had a little brazier with charcoal fire underneath it. Today, they're heated mostly with electric heaters that are attached to the frame of the table. And then a quilt helps keep you warm. And you can sit there with your laptop, your TV, your water, your tea, whatever. And trust me, the kotatsu is a place where once you sit down in the winter, you don't want to get up because it's nice and warm and toasty on your ankles and toes. In the summer, you can take the quilt off, and of course you don't run the heater, so it just serves as a table next to the floor where you can live your life on the floor. One of the things I am glad that I have left behind from my life in Japanese houses was the fact that they didn't have central heating and cooling systems. So the first houses that I lived in the 70s and 80s, we heated the rooms with sekiyu stoves, kerosene heaters that were smelly and not very efficient. Modern houses are mostly heated with these devices, mini split heat pumps that provide cool air inside the house in the summer, warm air in the winter, and are very, very much more efficient than, say, a window air conditioner or even a whole house heating unit. It's significant that the plan in Japan for millennia has been that you heat and cool people, not houses. So you only have heat in the rooms where there are people. You only have cooling in the rooms where the people are working or sleeping. And an important part of keeping warm at night is taking a nice hot bath just before getting into bed under thick futon quilts. Part of the experience is that you take off your shoes at the genkan. Interestingly, I always notice that when I take my shoes off, the toes are pointing into the house. And by the time I leave, magical pixies have turned the shoes around so that the toes are pointing away from the house so I can leave easily. You usually put on slippers. We have special slippers for the summer that are cool with reeds like tatami mats, and for the winter that are warmer cloth slippers. You wear those on the wood of the floors, the corridors, the kitchen. You don't wear them on the tatami mats of the rooms, if there are many rooms with tatami. You also have special slippers for the toilet, so that you deliberately keep the floor cleaner in the restrooms, cleaner in the rest of the house by not tracking in the same shoes in and out of the restroom. An interesting side note, when the pandemic hit, one of the things that was discussed here in America was the fact that you could be getting a virus on your shoes and tracking it into the house. And in Japan, that was much less of a problem because, of course, people take their shoes off. And that means they're less exposed to any kind of pollution or dirt or virus that might come in on your shoes into the house with you. In fact, cleanliness is very important and always has been. Daily bathing was established as a standard as early as the 13th or 14th century in Japan. If you could, you took a bath every day, if you could afford to. That might have been traditionally in a wooden tub. This is one made of cedar at Shofuso. Interestingly, the house that I lived in the 1970s in Japan had a very, very similar wooden tub. It had, the only difference between that tub and this one is that it had actual plumbing coming in with cold water, or you could run the heater and bring in hot water, and then it had a recirculating heater below it. Modern Japanese houses, you have a fiberglass or sometimes a ceramic tub, gas heater that heats the water that either can be brought in as hot water. There's also cold water that can be used as a shower. There's a drain in the side of the floor, just as there's a drain in the side of the floor here. You fill the tub with hot, clean water, and you keep it clean. Bathing is done by sitting outside the tub, dipping hot water onto your body, soaping up, washing off, these days using the shower to help you do that. And then when you're all clean, you step into the hot water of the tub and sit down and soak up to your shoulders. And it's an absolutely wonderful way of soaking away the cares, the troubles, and the pains of a long day. Of course, in the Machiya, most people couldn't afford to have a tub in the house. This is a very fancy situation with a tub and sink. You'll notice one difference between this and the American bathroom is that there's no toilet. The toilet in Japan was thought of as dirty and the bath was clean, so they're kept in separate rooms for the most part. The exception being hotel rooms. Anyway, people couldn't afford baths, so they went to public baths, a tradition that still exists in some parts of Japan, and had existed through the Edo, Meiji, and most of the 20th century. There's also a long tradition of going to hot springs baths, which sometimes are very elaborate with cold water pools and electric pools and whirlpools and just plain hot pools, all of which allow you to enjoy yourself. Sometimes they actually look on a garden or outdoors. You might have a big pool for lots of people, individual pools for single person bathing, and this might be hot water, or some of it might be cold water as well. I could go on and on about Japanese hot springs baths and sento baths and so on for hours, but I won't. And then there's the dirty part of the house. This is the Shofuso toilet, what in traditional Japanese might have been called a kawaya, literally the house by the bank of the river, or house by the river. I've seen some in Kyoto that literally were a trough like the top part of this, and you go stand over it and you can see the river beneath it. In most cases, in the elite houses, this would have had a box underneath it that could be taken out and sent to the fields as fertilizer. Of course, as things modernized into the 20th century, that became a beautiful Celadon urinal. This is 19th century style, again with the toilet, or the room for everyone here and the room for mostly the men here on the right. As time goes on, that became this. And then beginning in the late 1970s, we saw a radical transformation in Japanese toilets. Nowadays, you hardly ever see this kind of in-the-floor toilet. They've all been replaced with Western-style toilets, often with veritable control panel of things to shoot water out and clean your various parts. That water may be warmed. There may also be a switch for hot air. It's very convenient. Sometimes the seats are heated. Sometimes the seats are even cooled so you can be comfortable in the summer. In the efficient version of this, the water to flush The tank to flush is behind it, but the tank fills, at least in part, from the top with water that you can rinse your hands in, wash your hands as the tank fills, and then that gray water is used for flushing the toilet. So it's a very efficient, very environmentally sound kind of situation. Even though the pumps and the heating and all that is not very environmentally efficient. So they make up for it in water use, but they waste it in some energy use. One last room. This is the kitchen of the Shofuso. It's a 17th century farmhouse kitchen, basically, with a dirt floor around a wood-fired stove. If you turn the other way, you have a polished wood floor, a little brazier space, a space to put the trays out and arrange the meal to be served in the main rooms. This is the only piece of furniture in Shofuso. It's a cabinet designed for the house when it was displayed in New York, but to store utensils and even food during the cooking process. The Kojo Inn Kyokuden does not have a kitchen, so Yoshimura, the architect, decided to incorporate a kitchen from a 17th century farmhouse and sort of tack that on to the rest of the building. I've never had to cook in this kind of a kitchen, although the house I lived in Kyoto had an earthen floor in the kitchen. It was pounded so hard that I didn't realize that until I once spilled a whole pot full of hot water on the floor and the floor got soft. I was shocked. But I was cooking there with gas, as most people in Japan cook today. If there's one thing, in addition to the heating systems, that I'm not very enamored of in Japanese houses, it's usually the kitchen. They tend to be very small. Yes, they're quite efficient, but they're very tight, which is why you need not only a small refrigerator, but you may need the storage space under the floor. The back door, one thing you notice in most functioning Japanese kitchens today is not just a trash can here, but as many as 7 trash cans for these 7 different types of trash that have to be sent out on trash and recycling days. Thank you. That basically finishes what I have to say about features of Japanese houses. I'd be happy to respond to questions about what it's like to live in one. I haven't lived in this one, but I can tell you what it's like to be there and to spend time there. And you can check it out too. It's in here in Philadelphia. It has reopened since the pandemic. So since the end of June, it's open Wednesday through Sundays, 10 to 4 on weekdays, 11 to 5 on the weekends. And I'm happy to take questions about Japanese houses and what it's like to live in them.
Okay, Frank, let's see how. I don't have any questions at the moment. I'd like to draw everyone's attention to a question I posed in a poll, and let's check into the results. I'm going to share my screen right now. Hope this works.
I think I have to pull mine down. No,
you just hang in there and we'll see if this works. I guess it doesn't. Okay, so I posed a question, and Frank, this is a question for you as well.
I think you can probably try to share your screen now.
Oh, okay, let's see. Why, indeed I can. Can everyone see the
There we
The
go.
poll in progress. All right, for those of you who are on dial-in, I asked the question, which styles of architecture do you think have something to offer the world today to make modern life more fulfilling, or to conserve resources, or to reduce destruction of the environment that sustains us all? And here we have, there it is. So here I can see about 5 different styles that were typed in, and 40% thought that the warrior style, which Frank, you could come up with the name, wasn't that Buko?
Oh, Buke Zukuri or Shuden Zukuri.
So prehistoric styles, now we know who the romantics, the simple life. And here's the Shoin style, also at 20%, and the merchant townhouse at 20%. So Frank, would you care to comment on these choices and what, you know, what, how would you interpret that?
If, as an American, you want to go to Japan and live in a Japanese house, I would advise actually the Minka style. There are parts of Japan out in the countryside where you can buy an old Minka for as little as a few $1,000s. All you have to do is promise to rehabilitate it and to live in it. I've even heard there are a couple of villages that will give you one if you sign a contract saying you'll live there for 5 years. Machiya are nice to live in. I can also recommend the Machiya. It was a nice place to live. It was great to be conveniently located near buses and trains and all that, and near shopping and so forth. It's very compact kind of living. Everything is close together. The kitchen was just a few steps away from the tatami matted room where you do everything in the same room. So it's a dining room, it's a study, it's a bedroom, it's an entertainment room. You can end up doing all kinds of different things on the tatami floor. That's a very efficient way to use the space. Western style houses are almost by definition much less efficient. You have to have a separate room for your piano. You have to have a separate room for your children to play in. You have to have a separate room to sleep in, a separate room as a dining room. The Japanese use of space in that sense is much more efficient in any of these building styles. Of course, the elite houses are beautifully designed and very attractive and often feature more space, but still it's space that's used rather efficiently.
That raises an interesting question. I'm struck by the similarity and style of a minka to a typical 20th century single family home in a way. Well, not to mention the more modern urban Japanese styles look a lot like ranch houses, and that's another related topic you could explore. But I myself live in a 2-story, box with a pitched roof, a simple pitched roof, and it seems so similar, except for that mine has all framed walls, and the minka appears to be built more like a barn with post and beam joinery and a very open plan. Please elaborate.
You're right. The minka tend to have a very open plan, at least on the first floor. divided into a few rooms, but not very many. With that irori hearth that warms the space, whether we're talking about physical warmth or the psychological warmth of gathering the family around a central fire and listening to grandfather tell stories or whatever. It's a very attractively romantic kind of living in many, many ways. The machiya have a lot in common with the modern hybrid house in many ways, and feel a little bit like American urban houses. For example, I live in Philadelphia I live across the street from a row of houses in a twin, one half of a two-part building. But like the machiya, our twin is very narrow and deep and tall. So we have 3 floors with living or dining and kitchen on the first floor, a little bit of living room there, more of a living room on the second floor, and then bedrooms there and on the 3rd floor. But we've turned the 3rd floor bedrooms into offices because both my wife and I, as scholars, we both work from home and work from our offices at school. Seems like we work everywhere we live, everywhere we are. So there are a lot of similarities in that sense.
And to everyone, I see I omitted a number of important types on that polling, but I'm glad you brought in the Minka and the others. Let's check our Q&A now. Let's see. Aha. Oh, Timothy Gardner has just wanted to contribute that he says that for those interested, there's a wonderful cookbook authored by Nancy Hachisu, an American who married a Japanese farmer. She describes living in a traditional farm home and many of the traditional ways of making shoyu, vinegar, etc. Her other book, Japanese Farm Food, is also full of insight into traditional Japanese living, all wrapped up in food, of course. Frank, I think you already commented how the machiya and many of the other modern homes have a very small kitchen, which seems sort of geared to convenience food in a way. And I imagine the farmhouse might have been working with stuff literally brought in from the garden, and that takes counter space. Comment?
Well, the counter space was really that polished wood floor. And a lot of things were done on the floor. It's very interesting. My wife and I watch Japanese television dramas, and there's a whole genre of these dramas that feature family stories from the period between the 1850s, the 1860s, and World War II, and then up to the present day. These are almost always stories about women. And one of the big parts of the story is dealing with the kitchen, whether in the older kitchens, whether that meant getting up at 4 in the morning and stoking the fire back into life, cooking the rice, etc. Or in little dramas set a little bit later, women converting from a wood fire-based cooking method to gas cooking. And of course, a number of the stories include stories about blowing the house up or burning the house down because you misuse the gas stove in one way or another. Um, so there's a lot of that. But you often see people sitting on that polished wood floor, chopping on a chopping block beside it, or working in that way, or sometimes standing on the earthen floor and chopping on things, chopping on the on a chopping block, of course, on the wooden floor. So it was an interesting way of using it. The wooden floor often has enough space under it that, as we mentioned before, it could be used as a kind of root cellar. Some houses also would have water storage built in if they didn't have running water. A few houses also would even have a space where you could keep live fish. I see the poll results now.
Oh, they're totally skewed by having had the wrong categories.
Oh, well.
I'm going to launch another poll with we're all first time polling, so we'll get it right. Well, there's another question from Roger Saruda. And before I read Roger's question, I just want to mention, in the light of the slide on Katsura Rikyu, which, by the way, if you ever travel to Japan and you want to go there, if you set it up ahead of time as an outsider, you go to the head of the line. A little tip: once you're in Japan, you're doomed. There's a long waiting list. So Katsura, you all may recall, had the 4 seasonal tea houses scattered about the property. Well, Roger Saruda is and his wife, they coordinate volunteers at the Shinzen Friendship Garden in Fresno, California, USA. And that garden, and we could even put Roger on live here to testify to these matters, that garden has 4 quarters. It doesn't have many structures, but the plantings are arranged for seasonal interest. A very unusual, large stroll garden, very beautiful. So actually, I'm going to ask Roger's question right now. Roger says, with the decreasing availability of hinoki bark and the increasing cost, what other roofing materials do you foresee for the Japanese house?
Well, hinoki bark is only used for a few buildings today. The buildings of the Issei shrines, the imperial villas, and a very few other buildings. Many other buildings use either cedar or sometimes hinoki shingles are a possibility. You often see that on tea houses. There are other kinds of bark roofs using cedar bark or from other trees. And of course, many, the majority of Japanese houses are roofed with ceramic roof tiles. So roof tiles are the way to go in a whole lot of ways. There are now roof tiles made of plastic as well as ceramic. But for example, with the hinoki bark roof, if you're lucky, it lasts 30 years before it has to be replaced. And it costs a great deal to replace it. With ceramic roof tiles, they need to be replaced very, very rarely. As long as the building doesn't fall down, or they don't, they'll wear for 100 years or more before they wear out to the extent that they need to be replaced. That's a leading kind of roofing system in Japan. They can be laid so that they deal with the heavy snows of northern parts of Japan, or so that they can respond to the heavy rains in the more southern areas, and even to typhoon winds by pitching the roof just the right way. That's the most common roofing system in Japan. And of course, there are Western style roofs as well. Does that answer the question?
Let me see. Let me get Roger on the line here.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
The reason why I ask is we have an authentic tea house in our garden, and it came originally with a miscanthus thatched roof, and we were supposed to get 20 to 30 years life out of it, but did not take into account the peacocks, and the peacocks just shredded the roof. So we were looking at replacement, and it was cost prohibitive. So we ended up going with a redesign of a cedar shingle, trying to maintain the same kind of design or appearance of the roof.
Yeah, at Shofuso, the tea house actually has a cedar shingle roof, or a hinoki shingle roof, but it could be cedar shingles easily enough if we needed to replace them and wanted to save some money. There are also various versions of bark roofs that are made with cedar bark as opposed to hinoki bark. And we actually at one point talked with, believe it or not, Irish roof thatchers about whether we should convert our roof to a thatched roof. Ultimately, we decided not to. The other thing that happens in many of the minka is they'll re-thatch the roof, and then they'll cover the entire thatched roof with copper. And that then preserves the thatch, changes the appearance of the building a bit, but where the thatched roof will last 20 to 30 years, the copper roof will last 50 to 100 years. But they do look a little strange.
I want to let everyone know that I'm turning this into a meeting style thing where now be polite, but you can press your space bar to speak or even share your mugshot or your camera shot. So in other words, you can all unmute yourselves now. This seems like a logical time to have a little discussion. And I wanted to pose an initial topic for discussion. I'm very curious if anyone out there is looking to get involved. Roger Saruda provoked this because he's very involved at the Shinzen garden in Fresno. He and his wife, they organize a monthly volunteer event there. And our two previous speakers last week are both the curators of public display gardens, and they instruct and coordinate. So this is, I can speaking from my own experience, getting involved is a great way to learn all these things and make connections that lead to opportunities for learning and for action. So all you have to do to unmute yourself is press your space bar.
If just a backdrop, like I said, like this, I need to do that, and then partially to be up there. So I don't know. You might want to glove.
I might want to do what?
I said you might want to glove the sackcloth over
If you're in the Philadelphia area, we always have room for volunteers at Shofuso. You can work in the garden and work with a gardener who's been trained in both America and Japan. Came out of horticultural college here and then has spent time in Japan being trained on how to operate a Japanese garden as well. Or you can volunteer in the house and help with cleanup or maintenance or presentation of the house.
some tape.
I'm sure Kim would be happy to hear from you if you're interested in any of that.
Unless you want why I have this.
That's fine. And how much wrapping do you have to do?
I'm sorry.
How much rubbing do you have to do?
I don't do a lot. It's over. And the major sanding is done, so if you want to wipe this out, that's fine too.
I'm going to butt in here. Mr. Weiss, if you stay close to your microphone, then we'll all be able to hear you. The number one audio trap on Zoom is if you're too far from your, basically most computers have a really lousy microphone. So just like a cell phone, be conscious of your proximity and enunciate. And also for, also for good video, audio quality, everyone, I'm going to mute everyone, but if you have something to say, hold your space bar down and then let go of it. And this prevents all the feedback and so Roger, are you going to tell people who are passing through the San Joaquin Valley how to hook up and like what day of the month and things like that?
Unfortunately, we're city owned and city controls us. So the garden is not open at this time and we have no word of when we will be available. But it is a nice stop on the way to Yosemite if you're coming from the south.
I tend to forget about COVID-19. Is there anything anyone does that doesn't require working in a group? I should like to add that COVID-19 coincided with Oakland Fukuoka Sister City Association receiving this grant from Japan Society, and I spend a lot of my time working alone, recruiting panelists and grappling with the Zoom platform. I have to imagine there's always something to do and roles for people who are not interested or able to garden or pound nails or re-roof. As a matter of fact, I would invite Leanne Scott to fill us in on some of those things. A Sister City Association is busy, and ours at least has at least a dozen different distinct activities or programs, if you will. And we have a large and active group of volunteers, one of whom, JJ Kotler, happens to be attending this webinar as well, and might unmute herself and describe that just and quickly and inspirationally. I am somehow shut out.
Oh, hi, Peter and everyone. I'm sorry, I stepped away for just a moment. I just wanted to thank everybody for tuning in today, and especially the Japan Foundation, who gave us this grant to enable everyone to view this for free. As Peter mentioned, we had hoped to have classroom instruction, but then COVID hit, and so actually this, in some ways, is better because we are able to reach a broad audience. So we are grateful for the opportunity, and hope everyone will tune into the rest of the seminars that are coming up here. Peter, you might mention the dates and the classes, although I think most people probably know because they've either gotten an email or a personal invitation to join in. So that's kind of all I have.
Leanne, while you were, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
While you were away, I was sort of doing everyone on mic polling as to people's affiliation with Japanese style living environment organizations such as public gardens or museums, and sort of Shofuso is both, of course. Shinzen in Fresno is a garden that before COVID-19 had a regular monthly volunteer event, I believe on the third Saturday of every month, and that's Roger Saruda. Sister cities are much less sister city organizations are relatively unknown compared to these public Japanese gardens, which have, after all, been around off and on for a century. For the benefit of the remaining audience, would you care to describe the various activities that Oakland Fukuoka Sister City Association and our sister association in Fukuoka undertake to give folks an idea of the breadth of opportunity? Because you'd think you had to be a skilled carpenter or gardener to be involved. And speaking for myself, I have not found that to be the case. So please.
Well, the Sister City organization, we have been in existence since 1962. So way before my time, but I have been involved with the Sister City organization for about 30 years. We have 3 student exchanges, 2 high school exchanges, a spring exchange where 1 student goes each year, and we receive 1 student from our sister city in Fukuoka, a summer exchange where we alternate 6 students and 2 chaperones going to Japan and them coming here. The third is our Asian Pacific Children's Convention that is totally paid by the Fukuoka government for 4 5th grade students and a chaperone to go to Japan for 2 weeks. So those are our student exchanges. We have had adult exchanges over the years. We are coming upon our 60th anniversary in 2022. We had hoped to send a delegation next year, but given COVID, I don't know what, the traveling situation will be at that point in time, and that may have to be postponed. We were originally thinking spring, which now probably is too soon, given what's going on in the world. We also do a free event each October. It is our annual Otsukimi, a moon viewing festival. And of course, due to COVID, that has been canceled this year, unfortunately, but we hope to be back on track for next year. And that's always scheduled close to the full moon. We have Japanese entertainment such as dancing, taiko, martial arts, and we provide bento dinners and the entertainment. And of course, the East Bay Astronomical Society provides their telescope so we can view the moon. So we also host dignitaries when they come over here. We have a special relationship with the council, the Japanese consulate in San Francisco, and of course are very close to our other sister cities in the Bay Area. And I think we now have over 100 Japanese sister cities in California alone, which is quite a few. So that's what I have. The website, if you're interested in looking at anything, is www.ofsca/Fukuoka, or actually -Fukuoka.org. And I'm sure Peter can put that into the chat, or I can definitely put that into the chat. And I can also put our email if anybody has questions. So that's where I'll put it. I think that's the easiest thing. Thank you, Peter.
Yeah. What Leanne didn't mention is that she and I and many others in OFSCA have served as hosts for visitors from Fukuoka. And let me tell you, that was an education on my part, and also being a guest with a family in Fukuoka was really special. And it's obvious from the breadth of activities that it's someone with a flair for organization, for any form of leadership, can do, take charge. It's unbelievable how intensive any of these kinds of activities can be. So I'd also like to pose another question for the many in our participants in this webinar. What role being active in these organizations does to connect to your ancestral heritage. So we have many Japanese Americans present, and for also for those who may have been in the military services and been stationed in Japan, I imagine there's, you know, some connection. So just love to hear your observations in the few minutes remaining. So a reminder, if you wish to speak, you just press your space bar. All right. If there's nothing left to say, I really want to thank Frank L. Chance for taking the time to organize an incredibly thorough and sweeping presentation. I learned a lot, and it gave me some kind of new ideas that I'm going to somehow push out there. I think that the architecture we learned about was just brilliant in its adaptation to circumstances, and we all need to keep adapting. So thank you, Professor Chance. And thank you, Kim Andrews, who's succeeded Professor Chance as the director at Shofuso in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania's Fairmount Park, a place I almost got to visit in 2003 and intend to, I'm going to check that one off the list now for sure. Kim suggested that I contact Frank Chance, and that's worked out all very well. And Kim herself is a volunteer. Besides being director at Shofuso, she volunteers with the North American Japanese Garden Association, which is really becoming worldwide, having so many affiliated organizations in other parts of the world joining up now. This organization has a lot going on, and for which I'd like to thank staffer Marisa Rodriguez, who also attended the webinar today. Najka is a wonderful place to get educated. The conference is unbelievable with presentations from various international panelists and so forth. And it is will be rescheduled as soon as the COVID crisis is over, presumably to take place in San Diego. naga.org, najka.org. Let's not forget, Leanne, thank you for thanking the Japan Foundation, whose staffer Hiromi Zeppieri was in attendance today as well. Japan Foundation funds a lot of wonderful initiatives, including re-roofing at Shofuso. So That's really great that the government of Japan sees fit to support cultural exchange and, anyway, mutual understanding and appreciation. Thank you. So Frank Chance, Kim Andrews, OFSCA Volunteer Extraordinaire Leanne Scott, and Volunteer Extraordinaire JJ Kotler, and all the wonderful folks at NAJCA, Sukiya Living Magazine, Japan, sister city organizations throughout North America who also are co-sponsoring this event with publicizing it. The various bonsai, suiseki, and whatnot related clubs also in the circle of supporters here. All these groups welcome volunteers. Great place to develop democratic and leadership skills are always in short supply. So on behalf of everybody, I thank you all for attending and looking forward to Sunday, August the 2nd at 2 p.m. Pacific time, where we'll be hearing from a Japan-style traditional wood joinery carpenter named Jay Van Arsdale, also published author. And we're going to be broadcasting from his wood shop. And so we're going to get our hands on some of the wonderful things that Professor Chance showed us. So
Thank you.
it's time to go. Yes.
Thank you for organizing this. It was very good. And thanks to everyone for your good comments and questions.
Thank you, Dr. Frank L. Chance, for an illuminating presentation. Thanks to the original webinar audience for their provocative questions and shared knowledge. The conversation afforded the chance to imbibe the lecture information and form connections with like-minded people. Thanks to the Japanese people who, over generations, developed the life and living environment that's subject of these webinars, and who've generously shared this gift with the world. Thanks to the many artists, craftsmen, authors, and organizations worldwide and here in the USA who've made this known. Notably, the North American Japanese Garden Association, Bonsai and Suiseki Club, Japan U.S. Sister City Association, and Sukiya Living Magazine, which shows and tells how this living environment's intangible essence may be realized all over the world with a diversity of tangible materials and forms, not necessarily Japanese on their surface. They have universalized this living environment as the Sukiya style living environment. Thanks to the Japan Foundation Center for Global Partnership for financial support, and the Oakland Fukuoka Sister City Association for producing these webinars. We invite you to review other recorded webinars in the Japanese Style Living Environment webinar series. Thank you, and see you next time.